Great. Hello, YouTube. Welcome to our Open Ujima Wednesday meeting on July 14th. So today, as you all might know, we're in the middle of our summer series on participatory planning. So we've been having talks by different guest organizations who do that work to hear a bit more about their approach. So today, we're actually going to be joined by someone from the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, who's going to tell us a little bit more about their approach to this kind of planning work, a bit about their org history, and there'll be lots of time to ask them questions. So I'm going to see if, oh yeah, hey, Michael just joined us. Hello, Michael. Michael's in the house. So Michael, I'm going to give you a quick intro, and then I'll kind of pass it over to you to kick us off. Is that okay? Awesome. I'm seeing thumbs. We like thumbs. Great. Awesome. So today our guest is Michael Pardis from BCDI. Michael is executive director at BCDI, but he's also a researcher at the Bronx African American History Project. He's also the co-founder of the Bronx Brotherhood Project, a community-based college success program for Black and Latino teens in the New Settlement College Access Center. Michael draws on over a decade of experience as an educator. So he's been an instructor at the City University of New York Community College, as well as an assistant adjunct professor at Urban Studies. Oh God, is the bio wrong, Michael? Is this out of date? Oh Lord.
No, the bio's great, but it's so hard sometimes to hear like the stuff back at you. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, it's great. So yes, was also an adjunct professor at the Urban Studies at Long Island University in Brooklyn. So Michael's going to share more of an overview and some history today, and we'll have some more folks from BCDI later on who are going to go a bit in depth for the next couple of weeks. So please welcome to our virtual stage, Michael, and I'm going to go on mute and pass it to you.
Hey everyone, I'm really excited to share space with you all and happy to be here this evening if you're on the East Coast like me. So I guess the premise is, first, I was born and raised in the Bronx, and so much of my work has been centered in the Bronx. It's been centered in the way that, and this reflects a lot of BCDI, right, that our community has the solutions, whether you talk about social capital, human capital, whatever you want to call it, right? Our communities have that. The question or the challenge has been, what are the systems or structural kind of barriers, from systemic racism to, all the different isms and all the different challenges, right, that have stunted or prevented self-determination. For us, one of the ways that you see that clearly in terms of BCDI is, if you think about the Bronx, we often talk about the Bronx as a place of hopeful contradictions. So what does it mean to say that the Bronx is a place of hopeful contradictions? The Bronx is often marked and characterized by challenges. So it's a deficit model, right? Both in narrative and characterization. It's often how people engage the Bronx. They often hear about the tremendous poverty, right? How it's one of the poorest congressional districts in the country. They often hear about the health challenges, right? Of the 62 counties in New York state, the Bronx is the lowest ranked in health. Displacement, the Bronx is burning. It's probably the one that so many people are familiar with from the 1970s, the housing crisis. And of course, the Bronx has challenges. Excuse me. But we at BCDI take an asset-based approach. Part of that asset-based approach is what's happening on the ground. The Bronx has a number of creative and resilient community organizations, and I'll talk about that history in a moment. It also has the world's largest food distribution center. It's called the Hunts Point Terminal Market. The Hunts Point Terminal Market is the largest food distribution center in the country. The Bronx also, interestingly, has a tremendous amount of business and assets. Our place-based anchor institutions. So by place-based anchor institution, we would mean like the major zoo, the botanical garden, higher education, medical, systems, health systems, the major ones. So Bronx Zoo, most famously, Bronx Botanical Garden, higher ed, our hospital system. They spend $9 billion, $9 billion a year on average. Right? So the Bronx's GDP, right, is $44 billion. So in a place that's marked by quote unquote poverty, that's been marked by all these challenges to health, that's been marked by a high number of displacement, we actually see a tremendous amount of business. If you take the $44 billion of GDP that the Bronx represents, it would be one of the 50 largest economies among the states of this country. Right? Think about that. Of the states, the Bronx would be about 47, 46 in its economy alone. And its anchor institutions, right? These place-based, mission-driven institutions spend $9 billion a year on average. So this is the hopeful contradictions. While there's a number of challenges and risk and all those deficit, quote unquote, models, what we see is opportunity. And furthermore, we see a resilience and a creativity in our folks on the ground, in our communities, and in our neighborhoods. So I'll bring you a little bit into the timeline that brings us into BCDI. One is organizing. So there's a tremendous community organizing history of in the Bronx that I want to lift up and recognize for a moment. And there's been two areas where that organizing has been incredibly vital. One is in housing, the other is in environment. So the organizing history of the Bronx, two important post-World War II history, two important aspects. One, the community organizing history in housing. The second, in environmental justice. So in housing, right, after this narrative of the Bronx is burning and the inadequate policy response, we see a movement towards social housing unfold in the borough. Some of that in its very origins begin with, that concept you all have heard of, like sweat equity, where in the aftermath of buildings that were abandoned and land that was left abandoned or underutilized, folks just began to build on it. They picked up hammers, they used mutual aid, and they began to build and or repair buildings that were left neglected. So from sweat equity, we saw places like organizations like Banana Kelly, Northwest Bronx, and others begin to solve their housing challenges. I think a second kind of movement we see is the beginning of community-based organizations managing and maintaining affordable housing. And so in the 80s, you begin to see our housing movement fight for property, land that otherwise would have been left in lien or would have been left in foreclosure and would have compromised housing security. We see our communities fight back, and many nonprofit organizations became established and begin to take over these buildings and allow people who have been put into sweat equity or needed the affordable housing to begin to give them another option for housing security. We see a tremendous movement with the local government in that. And then lastly, into the 90s and 2000s now, we see the continuing movement for cooperative and social housing. I think the greatest representation of that is the community land trust movement that is now throughout New York City, but especially in the Bronx, where several sites have been located for community land trust making. And also there are coalitions that are fighting for land, like have done the analysis of vacant lots, et cetera, and now fighting both in policy and using other levers of power to gain community ownership to create more social housing. And we see our housing community land trust movement growing. So the second organizing history that BCDI and the Bronx comes out of is environmental justice. And the environmental justice piece has several components. One is a deep kind of history on just medicine and wellness on the health system. most famously, many people have heard about the Young Lords, which was an activist political group that had organizing in the Bronx and in Harlem. The Young Lords taking over one of our municipal hospitals, Lincoln Hospital, in 1969. They took over Lincoln Hospital to demand better treatment, some of the initial Bill of Rights that patients deserve, right, began to be crafted in response to the Young Lords taking over. So we've seen a deep Bronx history around health equity. We've seen in the 70s lead poisoning and asbestos, community campaigns to have blood testing. And if some of you are familiar with New York City and some of the challenges, just like NYCHA, our public housing system has had with lead testing, asbestos, et cetera. The Bronx in the 70s was at the forefront of both the fight back, as we say, right, blood testing and making sure people are adequately screened, and then the structural transformations that occur. Just really transitioning quickly. Lastly, for some of the environmental justice work, we've seen harm reduction and the built environment become important. So beginning in the 80s, we see Bronx coalitions on the ground come together to fight back against waste transplant sites, right, being left in our community. Access to the waterfront has been vitally important in order to create more green space. And now 2 of the largest community organizing efforts are liberatory efforts. We have a Cap the South Bronx effort. Cap the Cross Bronx Expressway, has been one of the efforts that we've seen. We also have seen the rise of community gardens, right? Community gardens have been a continuous sort of aspect of our communities for healing and for self-care and for self-determination, but it's grown even stronger. And I think the mutual aid movements that really advanced and grew in notoriety, at least during the pandemic, has made it clear that this is one of the ways that we need policy to recognize what we're doing in the future. So there's a deep organizing history. Why does this organizing history matter to the story of BCDI? The organizing history matters because for our organization, the turning point really happens in the late 2000s, around 2007, 2008. There was an armory, a large property, land lot that was in the northwest part of the Bronx. And this armory, our municipal government, right, our local government, had made a decision about its usage. And the municipal government, one of the interesting things is its decision was to enter a public-private partnership that would use turn the armory, among many things, to have a hockey ring. So in the Bronx, we would have a hockey ring that would be part for community use, part for private sector development activities, rather. And the simple thing for us was, how could an outside entity decide the usage of a community, of a space in the community without proper community, participation, input, but at the largest level, decision-making. Now, the struggle out of that ultimately led to a community benefits agreement that we're still fighting for equity in. But the top line result came a few things. One, that we need to fight for political power, right? That the elected officials who oversee, right, or supported an economic development project without the input, the participation, or proper decision-making from the community, that there's a problem with that. So part of our fight for political power, right, has to be in the electoral realm. The second piece was we needed to think more clearly about government intermediaries. So many in our economic development, many regions and cities have these economic intermediaries, development corporations that provide loans or financing, that work with businesses, that get an advantage or decide what to do with publicly owned property. We need to target those intermediaries, and we need to target them for what we call co-governance. These intermediaries that are government sponsored and or run that make economic development decisions, what to do with vacant land, what to do with foreclosed property, what to do with zoning, how to give out loans, how to do financing. We need co-governance, right? They need to be making their policies and decisions alongside community members. How do a group of people outside of the community be the ones to decide what to do with vacant properties or get to decide the utilization of land? That was the second lesson that came clearly to us. And the third lesson is that we need to start talking about community wealth. The hockey ring was a classic example of publicly owned property that was decided upon, its usage at least, by public officials, would do something that creates private wealth for the real estate developer and the outside businesses that would run the hockey ring. What wealth would it create for actual Bronxites? Why wouldn't Bronxites get to share in the wealth of the development? Why not local businesses? Why not local real estate? And furthermore, how would it address the racial wealth gap? How would it address equity? Excuse me. So for us, one of the realizations is that these three things: political power, co-governance, and community wealth. These are the things that we need to be strongly fighting for. We need political power in order to grow self-determination. We need co-governance in order to make equitable and community-led decision-making processes about development and planning. And finally, that we need to have a sharp focus on community wealth. There's all these economic development projects happening, tons of money going around in order for a region with $44 billion economy to run. And local Bronxites are not seeing any of it. And ultimately, this leads to like worker cooperatives, shared wealth enterprise, like that sort of focus that you would read on our website or hear from us. But that community wealth building was vital and was important. And so what does it look like? I'm mindful of the time, so I want to bring us to close here. It led us to what is called BCDI, right? So beginning in 2009, with this armory, with this challenge of the armory, hockey rings, lack of community input, participatory planning, etc., some organizers in the Northwest Bronx began to say, we need to have a different approach. Often what we're doing is fighting back. We're fighting back on a government decision on the zoning for our land. We're fighting back on legislation that sets or is harmful towards renters. We're fighting back against the rationale for how do we even use land? What do we do with land? We're fighting back from an approved plan to bring waste transport sites to our neighborhood. We're fighting back. Fighting back is important, right? And organizers need to have fight back. It gives clear calls to action. But we need to also fight forward. Simultaneous with fighting back to preserve equity, we need to fight forward to transform the system. Not just change the system, right? Part of often our fighting back is to change systems so we can survive. But we need to fight forward in order to transform systems. So that way our people not only survive, but thrive and have improved well-being and long-term self-determination. The history of organizing, the pivotal moment with the armory, it all led to a cumulative community knowledge from organizers, residents, and others that not only do we need to continue fighting back, but we need to fight forward. And so by 2015, we see the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative come to be with a clear focus, right? This organization, and our shorthand is BCDI, There's a lot of alphabet soup here, but BCDI, the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. In 2015, when we formally launched after a number of working groups and committees and other sort of activities to really sharpen our focus, there was a few things that happened. One was that in order to transform systems, we felt we need to think about what is the result that we want to see in the world. I'll repeat it, right? In order to transform systems, in order to do that cumulative knowledge, we thought about what are the results? What is it that we want to see in the world? And for us, it looked like shared wealth. Shared wealth looks like cooperative capital. Shared wealth looks like non-extractive finance. Shared wealth looks like worker cooperatives. Shared wealth looks like the people in community owning and self-determination over the means of production and et cetera. What else did it look like for us? It looked like network building. For us, it looked like building an asset-based approach of taking the organizations and community-based groups that exist and supporting their capacity and their growth. Not taking a deficit approach and saying, oh, we need another new entity, or we need to do the thing better. But to work with folks through accountability and through shared planning to improve the capacity, to build the capacity of the organizations that exist. How do we share communications tools and materials? How do we keep a shared system where we keep track of action steps? How do we know what each other is doing so that way we have aligned platforms and agendas? How do we vision set together, goal setting together? Those things where there's a number of organizations. We come from a deep history of organizing in the Bronx. A number of organizations that are fighting for social housing, fighting for economic justice, fighting for environmental justice and sustainability, doing people-centered, community-led. What's the network building needs to be a coordinating effort. We want to see a network building approach that's asset-based. What else is it that we want to see in the world? We want to see shared wealth. We want to see network building. We want to see institutional transformation, which comes back to the co-governance piece. We want to see institutional transformation where it doesn't have to be majority rules. It doesn't have to be appointees, political appointees. It doesn't have to be bureaucracy, right? We don't have to make decisions and we don't have to run our society in that way. We don't have to manage our society. We don't have to manage our people. We don't have to have social control. We don't have to live that way. Institutional transformation aligns to a deep commitment to democracy, one that believes in consent and consensus, one that focuses on cooperative cultures, one that takes seriously feedback, listening, input, etc. And so institutional transformation became an important fight forward strategy for us. And to round this out, one of the last things that was important of what we want to see in the world, we want to see leadership development. How does a kid like me, born in the Bronx, raised in the Bronx, educated in the Bronx, become the executive director of a nonprofit that does the long-term planning of the Bronx? That's critical. How do we keep that going? How do we build where we share in leadership? We rotate facilitation. We rotate hosting, right? We vision set and share the mic. We all have the capacity to develop campaigns, to do the call to action. We all are planners. That shared leadership component, where we don't silo and we don't silence, but we grow. Movement building, institutional transformation. So for us, these key components, shared wealth, network building, institutional transformation, this is what we wanted to see in the world. And BCDI, the organization, right, represents that fight back spirit. It represents that system transformation approach. And so for us, what that results in is it results in our organization, and we have, excuse me, two main kind of components I'll talk about right now. One is that we are currently in coalition creating, and we'll talk more about this next week, but we are doing a regional long-term planning process. We call it the People's Economic Development Plan. And there will be a 30-year plan for our region, the Bronx, New York. The question is simple. What Bronx do we want to see in 2051? How can we build a vision for that Bronx that is fundamentally, without question, the input, the ideas of our people? Bronxites, working class Bronxites, BIPOC Bronxites, Bronxites committed to intergenerational lenses, Bronxites committed to racial and economic justice. Unwavering, how do we build that Bronx? And we're doing it in coalition. So we have over 40 groups that have endorsed a platform that represents it, that we just ran through last political electoral season. We have over 12 groups in shared leadership that are doing the vision setting, goal setting, strategic pathway forward work together. We host people's assemblies. We host cumulative open access SWOT analysis, right? We do ideation sessions where people not only lift things that are happening that they think are promising, but ideas that are new that they would like to see. We've been doing it on Zoom. It's tough, right, during the pandemic, but we've had over 300 people attend our assemblies, and we had over 300 people attend the kickoff event. We phone banked over 200,000 Bronxites in a borough of 1.4 million, so we're really proud of that. So we have this long-term process where we're really committed to being open and to having the community lead us in the planning of it. And the second thing that we're working on is on our shared wealth work. So we are in the midst of building what we call the Bronx Fund, which is a community wealth fund that will, one, provide non-extractive financing capital to businesses and enterprises that are aligned, two, economic and racial justice that is place-based. And second, an investment fund, which turns the impact investing on its head to consider what is the equity and support that shared wealth enterprises, BIPOC Bronx run, collaboratively owned. What do they need in order to get to scale? So that way that Bronx economy is more beneficial to a larger group of Bronxites. So that way people long-term can stay and live in the communities they were raised and love. So there's a lot happening at BCDI, but then we're also working on the co-governance of that. What is the participatory governance, right? What is the community directed governance for that? And so wrapping it all up, that is what's currently happening, right? So I'll leave space for questions, but right now we are building the long-term 30-year People's Economic Development Plan with a commitment to deep democracy and finishing the conceptualization and ideation of a Bronx Fund, a community controlled wealth fund that prioritizes non-extractive finance and cooperative capital that results in equity, that results in cooperative cultures, that results in scaled wealth, where Bronxites are actually benefiting from the economy that not only exists, but that they want to create. And so that's our story. That's how we show up. That's how we got here, from this deep history of organizing that this is the foundation for our work, to the turning point that allowed us to crystallize we have to fight back and fight forward towards systems transformation, to a now 7-year and going process of what do we want to see in the world? Shared results and participatory, collaborative, cooperative cultures for building that vision, resulting in what we hope for is a 30-year regional plan that you'll hear more about next week, and a community wealth fund. I'm looking at 25 million in 10 years, a community wealth fund that allows Bronxites to have economic self-determination. I will pause there. I know we have a little bit of time. Sorry for going long, but I would love, I definitely see in the chat, can we take some questions or et cetera? Johnny, I see you put one in the chat. Invitation, would you like to vocalize it or just want me to?
No worries. Yeah, I'll definitely vocalize. I only put it in the chat because as a staff member, I wanted to step back a little bit and allow community to kind of raise their voice. So I will verbalize my questions and feel free to not answer all of them. We can be in community together as well and talk offline. Just wanted to hear a little bit more about how do you manage traditional funders, their expectations in terms of reporting back, which are really kind of centered around their own individual needs rather than community. Your visioning for the fund, as you know, Ujima has a fund as well too. We're pretty close to reaching our $5 million goal. Just want to hear a little bit more about how you're envisioning that work, and love to just hear a little bit more about the assembly work and what is the outreach approach to that, because it sounds like you guys get a lot of turnout. But if I can prioritize a question, I would say the third one.
I'll answer concisely because I'll leave space. Next week, our lead and one of the delegates from the regional planning process is going to be here. And then the following week, I'll have some folks come and talk about the fund. So I'll leave short answers because there'll be 45 more, hour and a half more to go over the next 2 weeks. But regarding funders, it is a super challenge articulating in their traditional terms the impact of this work. We have resisted over quantifying it, but we also are embracing the need to measure progress. I think a part of human life is scoreboards. I don't know if any of you like sports, but people kind of like scoreboards. Now, we don't want to use scoreboards as in the pernicious kind of way that racism uses scoreboards to value humans and who's better, who's worse, who's valuable, who's not. But we do need scoreboards to hold ourselves accountable. Are we making progress on this thing? We all live in a nonprofit and social impact sector that burns money to still have the tremendous racial wealth gap that exists. So there is an accountability around what are the outcomes. And our organization honestly has been trying to grow into that. We could talk offline. I have a data and evaluation background from education to academia. So we are leaning into performance measures, not to, pigeonhole folks and punish, not for it to be a hammer, but for it to be a flashlight. Maybe we can improve, the way our agendas look, or, hey, if our members have 100,000 people, if our organizations have 100,000 people in their membership, we can only turn out 100. Maybe we need to talk about what we're doing. So we are using data in that way. This fund, I'll skip to why $25 million. Right now, we have it pegged at 20 million in a CDFI-like entity that would provide the non-extractive capital, 5 million that would represent the impact investment, and we hope to get to that in 10 years. It is audacious. If I could get halfway there, I would feel accomplished. But you gotta shoot for that star sometimes, to galvanize folks. I'll leave it at that to make space for community. I know there was a few more, but.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Michael. Do want to invite folks to drop more questions in the chat or speak up if you're feeling curious about anything. We do have a couple of minutes left.
I don't mind if I do. I'm curious, Mike, and I know you don't have too much time to kind of delve into this, but I want to know, particularly for you, because you reference yourself as an executive director and the fact that you're here. And so, which I feel like there's a lot to that can be unpacked in terms of your own experience, your own background. What does that mean? And aligning yourself with traditional leaders and what that actually tends to look like in expectation. So I just want to hear a little bit more about how did you get to where you are really quickly, concisely, and what does that mean for you in leaving behind a legacy for those that are coming from similar backgrounds?
I think it's a great question. I think in short, one, I struggle with BCDI is not organized as a worker cooperative. It's not a self-directed organization quite in that way. So for long term, those are things we have to think about, right? We want to, as a leader, I think about it and to be like straightforward, Johnny. I think about what are the healthy practices and systems to practice what we preach, right? To allow small teams of our folks to assemble and create the economy, or facilitate rather the economy and the social structure that we want to see. So some of it is I do create matrix and rubrics to help us prioritize. I see that as something really important as a leader. In design thinking, the ideation part often is like exciting, you know? But then synthesis is often most difficult. Either how do we get it into something that we can manage, or how do we decide what to do? Because there's a lot happening. So often I see my role as, and one of the skill sets that we as an organization, like what is the rubric or what is the criteria to help us decide, to help us prioritize? There are facilitative methods for consensus making, like thumbs up or fist to five, or all these other ways. Sorry, not to be ableist, but all these other ways. But then there's also, what is the criteria? What has the weight? So there's a facilitative leadership that I try to practice, and then a responsibility, I think, to let's have some outcomes so that way we can define success. Let's have a way to prioritize, because not prioritizing is how we burn out our people. I've seen it way too much in this sector. And then creativity, right? Like we don't have to use the oppressor's yardstick, right? Like how do we want to measure success? So I facilitate and try to carry out tools for that. Next week, you'll see, not what I created, but we have a rubric for the long-term planning that represents how do we help people see how close or how far we are. And then the following week, we'll talk about what's not been easy, which is for the investment fund. How do we prioritize? What do we invest in? It's very challenging. Lastly, for myself, personally, I believe in servant leadership. So, I don't know if any of you have a church background, a spiritual background, whatever, but I really do believe in servant leadership. I do believe in that I'm here to facilitate and to help with our discretion, and to just be like a transistor. We don't have radios anymore, but transistors are just the thing that distributes, right, and makes efficient. So I literally see myself in the world or in this work as the transistor, like just help the thing click and connect. The fuel, the engine, the everything else exists. I'm not trying to be the engine, right? But I'm trying to be like a transistor. Sorry for the younger folks, transistor radios. If you look it up, maybe the analogy will land aptly. But there's a lot of unlearning. There's a lot of adultification that I'm unlearning. There's a lot of heteronormative that I'm unlearning. And there's a lot of nonprofit industrial complex that I'm always unlearning. I still have some of that in me. I'm a cultural anthropologist by background. I think we did mention all my academic stuff, but by background, I'm a cultural anthropologist. I taught for 10 years in the City University of New York. I was in a PhD program, and I decided to do this instead of that. And my students just always went into a system that stung, everything from institutionally, these credits won't transfer, or you can't get financial aid if you go full-time, if you go part-time, even though that's probably a better financial decision that systems should be benefiting, they don't. They didn't have enough credits in the right field, so they got to go back and get an entirely new degree. Employers who believe in workforce would not put them in jobs that they wanted to do or careers that paid a living wage. Like, it was just a mess that I saw students always enter. And so I decided I thought the best use of my skills was not in the classroom as a professor or as a researcher, which I spent a lot of time doing, but in trying to build, I guess, what we call social impact, but I would call Black liberation. So servant leaders do that. That's how I show up. I'm sorry, other questions or comments?
Other questions for Michael? We have about 5 minutes left. I know, Michael, also you dropped your contact info in the chat. So if people think of anything else after today, I think you can always feel free to message him. Seems like, yeah, you're good with that. Maybe I'll ask a question as we wrap up here. I'm not sure if you already talked about this. Forgive me if I missed it, Michael. How do you all engage youth in particular? Do you have a strategy around that? How do you see youth taking part in your organizing?
Great question. We, in our coalition, we have several organizations that heavily focus on youth leadership. Two of those groups focus on environmental justice. Excuse me. So a lot of stuff around access to waterfront, green space, community gardening, land use. They've been working on that. We have a third group who have been heavily focused on what we would call social equity. So police-free schools is one of their, restorative justice, liberation has been one of their focus. What we have done in our Bronx-wide planning process, for example, we've hosted youth power hours where their ideas get incorporated into the platform that we created. We've had at candidate forums where for municipal government, we had candidate forums for our economic democracy platform. We had youth create the questions and then ask the questions. I said create the questions, not like we make them and feed it to them. Like, what do you want to ask these folks? Is it aligned? Like that kind of process. And then historically, we have an innovation factory where we've been working for young people to create in the advanced manufacturing sector. What are the kind of like equipment, hardware, like tools that will solve local problems? And potentially it could be for social equity or, capital if they wanted to be a for-profit endeavor. We've opened up the design thinking, innovation, and like literally it's a fab lab, as they call it. We've opened that up to young people. We want to do more. There's two things we haven't solved that I think is inadequate. One thing that's inadequate is if this thing is going right, one of these high school students need to have my job by the time I hopefully get that $25 million for this fund or faster. One of these students should be ready for my job. What a better idea of that pipeline. So we are going to pilot an academies project that begins to have high school students look at finance and economy in a different way, build them into the cooperative kind of structure, introduce that to them, then build their leadership in urban planning so they could do the community facing sort of work, and then lean into actually holding pieces of the regional long-term planning. They already have, like, we had the power hour, they host the candidates forum, but facilitate the meeting, like carry out the next steps. We need that as well. If we mean what we say, then you let go control and power and let them, do it. But that's not easy for folks. But that is the direction that we need to go. We have only 12 have shown up. We have 12 college students this summer who I'm directly like supervising, working with on research and outreach, which any other place would say that's crazy. The executive director is like supervising like this large set of interns, but we have to mean what we say. So.
Yes, I love that. Thank you so much. That was super thorough. Folks, please give Michael a virtual round of applause. That was wonderful, and you dropped so many gems. So thank you for sharing space with us. And we're going to be hosting more folks from BCDI in the coming weeks. So definitely going to be a lot more we're going to be covering next week and the week after. So look out for that. Great. So I think whoever's doing notes, thank you for taking notes. You can go ahead and take a breather. We're going to say goodbye to YouTube. We're going to stop the recording now. Goodbye, YouTube.